Okay, great. So Rotary Club members, I'd like to introduce to you Bryan Eric Simmons. Um, in the sibling pool of the Simmons family, he is the fourth child and my little brother. I'm kind of like his mommy too. We bonded as young children when I was taking piano and he was a little toddler, and he would come and sit next to me on the piano stool while I played. And he's learned to play one of my first renditions that I had to play in recital, Fur Elise. And he knows how to get to me because he'll send that song to me or call me up and play it or whatever. But that's my little brother, and I'm so proud of him. But Bryan is a very special person in life. Um, he worked hard and got out of college. And if you read his bio, you know that he studied European history at Harvard College after attending Exeter Academy. So he left home as a ninth grader, and he managed the world pretty well for a ninth grader who never returned back to Memphis, Tennessee. And I'm very proud of how he handled himself in that situation. He currently holds Vice President of Communications at the Arcus Foundation after serving with IBM and Lotus and so forth in his career, but he is actively pursues other things besides his career. He has a wonderful voice that I found out about when he was at Harvard, and I was invited out to the president's house to hear the Crocodillos sing, and they told me, look through the door there, and this person started singing, and I realized, oh, that's my brother. And I was like, he can sing. Now nobody in our house knew he could sing like that. We knew he could play 4 or 5 instruments, but we didn't know he could sing like that. So that's a passion. He loves food and he loves to travel. And he's going to share with you some things that I thought might be interesting in recognition of Black History Month. So I turn it over to my little brother.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you stopped talking so that I wouldn't start crying. When Evelyn first suggested to me that I might join you all, I thought, why would I join? I'm not a professor. I'm not a historian. I'm not a television journalist. But I said yes because I like to say yes to Evelyn. And then I did a little bit of reading too. And I said, let me remember what is Rotary about? I saw that in the first word of Rotary is peace. And I apply to that I intuit from that understanding is one of the things that Rotary is about. And so I thought, well, it's Black History Month. What should I share? What could be useful and helpful to people, and what could be contributory to peace and understanding? And that would be, I guess there is value in just having a moment with a Black American to talk about Black History Month. And I'm gonna speak very informally and try to offer some provocations for things for us to think about, maybe even talk about over Zoom during the time allotted. I have found it pretty interesting to reflect on some work that I have done, some non-academic research, and some reflection that I've made on this topic. A couple of weeks ago, and I mentioned this not with any particular, it's not an attempt to make a jab at anyone, but you may recall a couple of weeks ago, there was some controversy because the Senate Minority Leader made some comments about who votes and who doesn't, and he referred to African Americans and Americans. And some people took great offense to that, and some people assumed that he meant that African Americans are not Americans. I don't necessarily think, sometimes people trip over their language. I don't know that he meant that or not, but it made me think about why did we have Black History Month anyway? Why did it happen? And it happened I think because for a long time, those of us who went to, and those of us who were in school, the history that we were taught in school, the American history that we were taught in school it didn't present Black Americans as being Americans. And it did not present um, aspects of American history that relate to Black people as part of American history. So a student could go through all the way through high school 30 years ago, and they really would know nothing about the role of Black people in the United States, or the history of Black people's presence, culture, and contributions. So for me, Black History Month and many other and all the other months of the year it's very interesting to me to go on an exploration to sort of see where am I, where do I fit, and where do my ancestors fit into the history of the country. And and some of it's been very fascinating to find myself there. So a lot of this has happened through research that I've done trying to see what was the pathway of our family through American history. The farthest back I've been able to go is to a man by the name of Armistead Buford, who was born in 1822. He was born in 1822 in Mississippi. And his parents were from Virginia. One was from Virginia and one was from Alabama. And eventually you start to connect the dots and really come into knowing, yes, my people have been here and participating in this economy and in this culture all of this time. And I thought, wow, how did his father get to Mississippi from Virginia? And why did his mother come to Mississippi from Alabama? And then I connect the dots to other things I'd learned in history about the advent of the cotton gin and the boom of the cotton industry. The fact that by 1860, 57% of the 57% of US export was cotton. So in 1860, 57% of all of US exports were cotton. And it took labor, it took enslaved labor to produce that cotton. And so once the gin was available to propel that industry, that labor was needed to come from some of the northern states. And many, 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 many enslaved people were sold to go down to Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi, and even Texas to raise cotton. And so there I could see, oh, there's my ancestor actually in that migration, in that flow, in that economic history. And it gave me, ironically, that might sound very dark, but it made me feel just much more connected to the fabric. I could see my face and see my ancestors' faces in the fabric of the country. In another side of our family, my research, we'd always known in our family that we had an ancestor, a great grandmother, a great grandmother of mine and Evelyn's, who had been born on a plantation in South Carolina, but we never really knew what plantation it was. We knew that she had 3 children with her, her enslaver, who owned her, and that at the end of the Civil War, she had moved from South Carolina to Mississippi and had bought some land there. Very unusual for someone who's just been enslaved, but she somehow had the means to buy 80 acres of land. And Evelyn and I still are part of an extended family that are descendants of that woman, who have a reunion every year. And it's a very evolved organization with a committee and a program book, a scholarship fund, ads in a program each year, a lot of efforts, committees that are try to establish and learn more about the history of the family. And through some research that I did, I was able to finally identify the plantation that this woman had come from in South Carolina. And it turns out she was from a plantation called Millwood Plantation that had about 200 enslaved people living on it. It was founded by a man named James Edward Calhoun, who was the first cousin of the senator from South Carolina and later the vice president of the United States under Andrew Jackson. And they were very much, the Calhouns were slavery proponents. And I was able to learn what was produced on that plantation, that they did produce cotton, corn, and tobacco. There, again, I've been able to see documents that showed after the war was over, James Edward Calhoun actually had to write a letter to ask for amnesty, explaining that he never had really been a Confederate, but that he had the support he had offered to his neighbors who were active in the Confederacy, that he had provided that assistance based on his Christian empathy and not out of any political orientation. Whether we believe that or not, it was very interesting to see, to actually see that letter. I was also able to see a ledger that he kept of the enslaved people he owned. And I could see the way that I was able to confirm that this was in fact the plantation that our ancestor had come from, was that when she moved to, after she moved to Mississippi with her 3 children, she later in 1868 married another formerly enslaved man who had also come from South Carolina. And we were able to see the marriage bond or marriage certificate. And on that, she had written her name, Celia Calhoun, and she had written the date of her birth. And through an Ancestry.com connection, I had met a woman who was doing research about her family, she had ancestors live on the same plantation. And she had obtained a copy of a ledger that he kept of all of his enslaved property. And it showed her name and the same date of birth, April 8th, 1839. And again, it was just very exciting to actually see documentation, because we often are around people who are say, well, my people came over on the Mayflower, or my people came at such and such a time. And a lot of Black Americans do not know this kind of detail about the texture and character of their ancestors' lives and what they worked on and whom they lived, with whom they lived. Other connections to American history. Our father, Evelyn's father, and my father, who died last, it's not last year anymore, who died in early 2020 at age 100. Daddy actually, his family were somewhat migrant workers in a way. They sharecropped, moving around to different towns in Mississippi between back in the late teens and through, I think, all the way up to World War II. They were, before they moved into the city of Memphis, they were farming in Mississippi in various places. And there's one plantation that's very near Memphis, actually. It's in, because the house that Evelyn and I grew up in together was about 6 miles. It's about 5 or 6 miles. It's in Memphis, but it's about 5 or 6 miles from the Mississippi state line. In fact, the city limits of Memphis border 2 other states. You cross the river downtown and you're in Arkansas, and you go south from our house into Mississippi in about 12 minutes. And my father and his family, through the 1920s, they were on a plantation called the Abbé Leatherman plantation. It was a very, very large cotton operation. my father explained to us a number of rituals that went on that land. Most of the Black people were actually, they were picking and chopping cotton. There were what's called riding bosses or overseers who were on horses, usually lower socioeconomic, usually poor white identified people who were supervising them, and who were, from the perspective of the landowner, all those people, regardless their race, were kind of equal to each other. They were the cheap labor, and the labor to be managed. My father explained to me that as a small child, he remembered playing with the son of the landowner. They were sort of the same age, although the way that they were socialized to engage with each other would change over time as they got older. And a couple of years ago, while I was in Memphis, I opened the paper and there was the obituary of the owner of this land, of this cotton operation, was a man. It was Richard Leatherman, and Richard Leatherman III, who was very close to my father's age, died a couple of years before our father did. And I read his obituary, and it was explaining how the first Richard Leatherman had come into all of this vast land that had been turned into this plantation, and one of the largest cotton producers in the Mid-South. And it explained that he had acquired this land through a land grant from the Chickasaw Indians in the 1830s. And again, connecting some of the history we'd learned in class to what had a connection to my own family's experience, I thought, okay, that wasn't really a land grant. That was part of the, an unfortunate chapter in American history where actually these Chickasaw Indians were forced to go to Oklahoma and walk the Trail of Tears and have their land taken from them and redistributed to people. And so as I keep moving through these various paragraphs of storytelling that I'm sharing with you, you can see how interesting it is for a Black American to connect the dots and feel something more than an abstract connection to all the history of this country. So the more I read and the more I research, the more I find myself and my people in every aspect of the country's cultural and economic development. And when you do more and more exploration, what you start to understand is that Southern food, what we mostly know as Southern food, the things we associate with the Southeastern cuisine, gumbo and sweet potatoes, sorghum. These were all things that came to the United States with the enslaved people from Africa. When they were on the boats coming over, some of them would be assigned the role of cooking, and they cooked what they knew how to cook. They knew how to plant and manage rice, for example, and that's why many of them were expert in that, because they had done that in Africa. And then you end up with things, all those rice-based dishes from South Carolina, from the low country over in the Carolinas, the chicken purlieu, the gumbo from New Orleans. And so another thing I wanted to mention also that's another family connection to American history is cowboys. We all grew up watching Bonanza and numerous Westerns and fabled characters like the Lone Ranger. And in fact, one in four cowboys was actually Black. And I was doing a little reading in the Smithsonian magazine the other day and got more detail, but Evelyn might surely remembers that on one side of our family, there's a whole branch our great grandfather's brother and family, their family back in the, I would say in the early, for a very long time, there's a certain branch of our family down in Yallabusha County, Mississippi, are known for their horse handling, and they're very involved in rodeo. Um, and I thought that they were that was sort of anomalous. At one of these big family reunions where we'd have 100 or couple of hundred people, there was a gentleman, a distant relative of ours, who would show up with a horse. A horse he had trained. He would tell the horse to stomp her foot 7 times, not 6, not 8, but and the kid, we would be so fascinated by this. But what I didn't know, that this was a whole tradition in that branch of the family, and they'd been involved with handling horses for generations. And what I also didn't know, that this was also a big part of the Black American experience in the United States, because leading up to the Civil War, many landowners and people who had owned slaves had moved into Texas and they brought their slaves with them. They moved into what then, it wasn't the United States yet, it actually was Mexico. And Mexico had strong feelings against slavery, but these Americans would bring their slaves anyway. And then when the Civil War broke out, and many of the white landowners went off to fight for the Confederacy, they left the cattle to be managed by their enslaved Black workers. There was no barbed wire at the time; that had not been invented. And when these Confederates came home from the war, a lot of their livestock they'd lost control of them. And this was a very active period for people who were in that line of work that we refer to as cowboys. But it was a lot of the now former slaves who had these skills. So that about 1 in 4, I'm told, of what we know as cowboys, although we didn't see them on the TV series, 1 in 4 of them was actually Black. And so in the end, it turns out that there really is there is no real separation between, it's a false distinction to Black history and American history. They really are one and the same. So I put together a list. I thought there were a few things that might surprise people, again, that continue to make this point about the integral nature of the histories of our various communities. So 2 of them I mentioned already. I think I mentioned that cotton was 57% of US exports in 1860, that 1 in 4 cowboys were Black, that macaroni and cheese, very popular in the United States, and apparently thought of as by a lot of Black Americans as soul food. The way that macaroni and cheese became popular in the United States is that a Black cook that Thomas Jefferson took with him to Paris when he was the ambassador to France had learned this dish over there called macaroni pie, very similar to what we know as mac and cheese. And he had brought it back, and people who came to dine at Monticello at Thomas Jefferson's table, it became a thing that people wanted to experience it. And in fact, that recipe is in a book that you can order. I meant to have it right here by the screen to show to you, but it is a cookbook of the recipes from Monticello, and this macaroni pie is one of them. So that's an actual interesting intersection between Black American culture and French culture, but also something that's become very American, that started with someone Black in this country. that a lot of the cookbooks that were famous in the 20th century, in the 19th century, a lot of the cookbooks that were attributed to white women were actually the real authors and cooks behind those books were the Black maids the Black cooks who worked in these women's homes. And so it really, they were not the developers of the recipes. Black Americans have invented a lot of things that are right at the center of American culture, including the mechanism for an ice cream scoop with the mechanism inside to push the scoop out once it's been gathered up by the main part of the scoop. Potato chips and refrigerator trucks. These are all inventions of Black Americans. At the beginning of the Civil War, enslaved Blacks actually outnumbered white identified people in South Carolina. And in 1860, the market value or the capital value of enslaved Blacks in 1860 was actually greater than the value of United States manufacturing and railroads combined. So all of those are the things that when you add them all up, and some of them are dark and some of them excite pride, but they are all signs that there really is, if you're looking for anyone who's looking for, where is the Black history and where is the Black person in American history? Where is Black history? The fact is, and I think I like to be able to say this to a crowd that will understand it, that it's like that old Palmolive commercial where the woman says to the woman, she says, "You're soaking in it." So I think I would like to invite some questions and some commentary and maybe some discussion. But where I come out at the end of all of this is, I think it's really exciting to learn this information, to make these connections, to be reminded that we're all American and that we all there's a culture that's really quite integrated, that's washing all over us. And when we persist on drawing a distinction, it's really pretty imaginary. One thing Evelyn didn't mention to you when she was introducing me is that when I was 15 years old, I had the opportunity to go and live in France for a school year. I spent my 11th grade school year living in France. I'm really thankful for that experience because it's not something it's the kind of experience that's pretty impossible to have these days. Because when I went away to France in 1977, there were no cell phones, there was no Zoom, there was no AOL Instant Messenger. I was really gone and I was really immersed, and I had to speak French, learn French, and be in that culture every minute. And my parents were not going to be talking to me on the cell phone every day and instructing what I was doing. If I had a disagreement with my host family, I had to work it out. I didn't get to call home and tell them to call the head of the program, to then call my host family and tell them, why aren't you letting him do this or that or the other? I was really away. But anyway, I'm getting a little off topic. What I wanted to tell you about that experience is that I had grown up in a city. We have a lot more diversity in the United States than we once did. So in the Memphis that is today, I see Asians, I see Vietnamese people there, I see more Chinese people there than I did when I was a child. I see Latinos. But when we were growing up in Memphis, you were either white or you were Black. And if you were anything else, that was very confusing to people. And you didn't get confused often because pretty much everybody was either Black or white who was there. And it was fairly polarized because we had grown up in a household. Martin Luther King was killed in my city when I was 7 years old. I remember the day, I remember the weather. I remember the I am a man sign in our yard. I remember driving with my father to a dump because there was a sanitation strike, so we weren't having garbage pickup. All those things make an impression on a kid, and so you never forget them. But when I was in France, I remember thinking, wow, when I was at home in the United States, I just thought there were these two worlds, this black community over here and this white community over here. And what I realized while at age 15, living in another country, I realized that all Americans have so much more in common with each other, no matter who we are, no matter what we are. And I thought, what is all the fuss about back home? Because we're all so American. And that has really stayed with me and made me wish that every American teenager could go and live abroad for more than a minute before they, so that they can actually dispel some of the thinking that we get, drilled into our heads. So I guess this is my message is one about unity and about the fact that whether we know it or not, we're super integrated already. And if we can live into that and think about that and be mindful about it, our lives are all going to improve dramatically, and particularly the lives of all the young people in our lives whom we love and for whom we hope to have much more in that regard than we have. So I know I thought I had very little to say, and I think I've talked a long time. So I'm going to stop talking and take guidance from the MC and from the rest of you about what happens next.
So we will oblige you a question and answer.
Okay,
Thank you. They're applauding you.
thank you.
And are there any questions from the people on video, and any questions here?
Evelyn,
Yes.
it's Mort. Can I make a comment?
Yes, go right ahead.
I just happened to read the other day a book about the Civil War. Andrew Johnson, when he became president after Lincoln's assassination, he made the upper class white people write letters of apology, or as Bryan suggested, as Calhoun had to do, to say they were not really Confederates. And that was because Johnson himself was from a lower class background, and he wanted to stick it to the people of a higher class. But very interesting to hear the personal connection in your family. That's great. Bryan, your presentation was just wonderful. Very much appreciated.
Thank you so much.
Bryan, this is Nathan Parker. I just wanted to say this was a wonderful presentation. I've been a superintendent of schools for a long time, and I've seen a lot of education about Black history, but this is the best presentation about Black history in a meaningful and thoughtful way that I've ever experienced. It really literally brought me to tears. So I want to congratulate you and thank you so very much. Also want to mention that there's a lady who lives in Summit. Her name's Lisa Winkler, and she's written a book called Black Cowboys Ride Across America. And
I'll have to get that.
Seeing that, and it's really, I haven't read the book, but I've talked to her a lot about it, and I thought that you might be interested in that. And if your sister will give me your address, I'll send you a copy of it.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate your compliments. I mean, I've never done a talk like this before. You're encouraging me to maybe organize it more and refine it. so that I can be more consistent if I were able to do this again. I've shared my screen in case any of you want to see. That's I've got on the screen, I believe if you're on Zoom, you can see, that's a
Yes.
picture of the man who was forced to write the letter.
Right. And
So-
I will just say, coming from Norcross, Georgia, which is 30 miles outside of Atlanta, and spending most of my time in the North, it's really nice. There's something about growing up in the South, black or white, that's really different than growing up in the North, where I think there's a lot more segregation in terms of whites don't necessarily know many blacks and vice versa, and which was not true in the South. But anyway, I really appreciate I don't mean to repeat myself, but really appreciate the lesson that you gave today.
Thank you so much.
So,
Yeah. Hi, Brian, this is Jim Fleischman. First of all, I thought that was just a brilliant presentation and I really appreciate it. And one thing that resonated with me was your comments about spending your year in France. And one of my heroines, historical heroines, is a woman named Josephine Baker, who I'm sure you're familiar with, who I think had maybe not an exact situation, but certainly a very similar situation where she left the United States. She was an extremely well-known Black entertainer in the 1920s, but she just couldn't get the recognition that she deserved, went off to Paris and was an amazing hit on the stage in Paris, and went on to have an extraordinary life, but had many of the similar thoughts that you did about how extraordinarily American all Americans are, based on their common experience, regardless of whether they were whatever color they were. And it just thought it was a very interesting commentary. It resonated with me when I was thinking about her. But I very much enjoyed your presentation, and thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I am Ila. I come from India, and you cannot even imagine how diverse the population of India is. And there too, there are people who look down on people. We are human beings, and the trait of wanting to look down on some other type of person is rampant throughout the world. Fortunately for you, France is one of the places.
I'm having a little trouble hearing, actually a lot of trouble. Maybe Evelyn, could you repeat? what
France
she-
was one of the places where there's a lot more tolerance. When they left their colonies, they allowed every native person who was in their colony to come to France and become a citizen of France. And that was extraordinary. That never happened in any other European country. But
Yes, and arguably, I would say, if you really think about citizenship, and the struggle that we have had in America is that after the end of formal slavery, there's just been a resistance to allow the former slaves and their descendants to actually be full citizens in the United States. And we don't, I think that that's really known to people. But
the injustice towards the native people is even more shocking. When you think about it.
So Brian's been sharing with you some pictures from our family album that he started with Mr. Calhoun, who fathered my great, great, great grandmother's 3 children that are shown in that picture. And the man she met after she went to Mississippi, we have a document where which President, Brian?
it's Grover Cleveland.
Grover Cleveland signed her land grant, her 80 acres of land was signed by him. And the man that's sitting, let's see, She's seated on the bottom right there. And the man sitting to her left is the man that she met in Mississippi and married him later. And so her children took on his name, not the Calhoun name. And that's why we have this, see, I'll be 74. The 75th Green Reunion will occur in August of this coming year, because she wanted them always to know what their heritage was. And she passed that down. So Bryan's been our historian in the family. And he does a really good job of keeping up and finding pictures. And it's been a really good experience for my grandchildren who really want to know. Have a question.
Well, it's very exciting after having your family's oral history confirmed, and then to actually to know her date of birth and to see what her signature looks like. There's something very grounding and affirming about that. And so I'm really excited that we've been able to do that for our relatives. And who you see now, this is our great-great-grandfather, who was born into that plantation in 1861, and who moved with his mother and his two siblings to Mississippi in 1865 when he was 4. We joke that he looks a bit like Leonardo DiCaprio, which he sort of does. But he was a farmer, field hand. He supported his family and his 9 children, farming and being either farming for himself or being a farm hand in Mississippi.
Yeah, curious, any communication between the other Calhoun family and your family?
What's very interesting is that there hadn't been, I'm actually overdue to speak with a woman who, she lives in Charleston, and she met a friend of mine who showed to her this content, and she reached out to me saying that she wanted to get in touch because she actually has she's not descended from James Edward Calhoun. The irony is that James Edward Calhoun actually he left no white identified descendants, only the ones that he fathered with enslaved women or formerly enslaved women. And he actually included in his will some land that was meant to go to some other mixed race children that he had fathered much later in his life than he did our family members. And but this woman was from another branch of the Calhouns, and she was very interested, and I really do have to reach out to her. She wants to talk to me. She said she has some heirlooms, and I don't know what the heirlooms are, but she doesn't want them, and she thinks they may have value, and she doesn't know. She's been trying to figure out what to do with them. And I think that there are probably some good options for her, because the history, dark and brilliant, it's still all American history, and it needs to be known. So because we need to know our mistakes, and we need to know the character of what happened. And so when I do speak with her, I want to encourage her to find the right museum situation for whatever these items are, because someone can contextualize them in a way that can be useful to people's learning without her feeling that she is somehow profiting from something that was immoral. So that's the one communication that I've had.
Teaching you to profit from the immoral?
So unless there are other questions, Bryan, thank you so much.